Welcome to The Real News. I'm Lynn Fries, reporting from the UN Geneva on the 2017 launch of UNCTAD's flagship report, the Trade and Development Report, as its main author, Richard Kozul-Wright, is given the floor at the UNCTAD Trade and Development Board meeting. Here's a clip of that meeting.
Finance, not trade, not technology, has been the dominant force shaping the trajectory of the global economy over the last 30 years. It'd be nice to have a kind of killer diagram that would kind of summarize our position in one chart. I haven't found that killer diagram. We have three diagrams that speak to what we think are the problems with the hyper-globalized world, the problems of growing inequality, the problems of growing indebtedness, the problems of insufficient investment, and the problems of increasing insecurity. We think those are four common features that one finds across developed and developing countries in the world that has become hyper-globalized. And to some extent, these three charts, again in the case for the United States, are an attempt to capture those kind of dynamics. The first chart on my left-hand side is an indication of the widening gap between productivity, which is the blue line in this chart, hourly productivity in this case, and wages or compensation. The red line is hourly compensation. And in the case of the United States, that divergence between what people are making and what people are being paid to make stuff has been rising considerably over the last 4 or 5 decades, but quite dramatically over the last 3 decades as real wages have essentially stagnated in this case in the United States. The middle graph, I think the orange line here is private capital formation. And one of the arguments for financializing the world was this would be good for investors, good for investment. And of course it has been very good for paper investors, people who make their money out of rising asset prices. It has not been good for people who are investing long-term in people and equipment and machinery, which is essentially the yellow trend in the middle chart, which has been declining systematically over the period of hyperglobalization, at the same time that debt, and particularly in this case household debt, has been rising at a tremendous rate in the period of hyperglobalization. So it's not being good for investment, and it's forced people into a level of indebtedness that we think is a source of serious instability. And finally, it's a world that doesn't really recover very successfully from when problems occur. The final graph in this triplet is the recovery from 3 crises. The blue line is the recovery from the Great Depression. The green line is the recovery under Ronald Reagan from the post-79 1980 crisis, and the red line is the recent recovery in the United States. And it's been tepid at best. And it certainly doesn't compare with the Reagan recovery, let alone the recovery in the 1930s. And this is the same graph for the United Kingdom. I apologize, that was the bias of my report. Similar kind of, you see similar trends. There are differences across countries, of course. The historical and policy differences, but the broad trends are surprisingly similar across certainly the advanced world in terms of rising inequality, falling investment, rising debt, in particularly household debt, and slow recovery from crises. So that's our understanding of a hyper-globalized world and the problems that policymakers should be addressing if they are going to try and build more inclusive and sustainable economies.
Joining us now to discuss this is Richard Kozul-Wright, Director of the Division on Globalization and Development Strategies here at UNCTAD. Welcome, Richard.
A pleasure to be here.
A major event in the 2017 launch of the Trade and Development Report is the presentation of the TDR to the UNCTAD Trade and Development Board. Give us some context on that.
Obviously, our immediate audience for the Trade and Development Report is the members of UNCTAD itself, and UNCTAD is a universal body, so it has full membership of both developed and developing countries. So the report is presented to the to the full membership at our Trade and Development Board each year. So they are the first consumers of the ideas in this report. The Trade and Development Report is now 35 years old.
In the current debate over what's at the source behind the problems like rising inequality in today's globalized world, you don't point the finger at trade or technology, the usual suspects. Comment on that, and more broadly on what differentiates the direction of your report from that of most other international institutions.
Well, I think we are really taking the debate away from what we see as a slightly sterile polarization between trade and technology as the sources of inclusiveness, precariousness, insecurity, and saying, look, there are the way in which markets are being structured now by large financial and corporate bodies is at the source of this polarization and insecurity, and we need these very large private institutions have begun in fairly dramatic ways to corrupt the public sector. That's true both of the public sector at the national level and the public sphere at the international level. And so we need to find ways of mitigating that economic power without, one hopes, damaging the benefits that come with scale, because there are advantages of having large, big, innovative firms that can undertake research and development and innovation. But if they become a law unto themselves rather than a law subject to wider democratic will and representation, then that's where the problem lies. So we have, getting back to the underlying systemic causes of why people have become disillusioned with the current state of affairs. It's not about trade. People are not disillusioned with trade. I mean, they know that trade brings benefits as well as costs. They're not disillusioned with technology. They know that technology has been transformative, even as it's brought challenges to them. What they're disillusioned about is the way in which political representation has been corrupted by economic power. That's what really, this is what people are finding it increasingly difficult to deal with, and that they don't trust the people that are there, that claim to be representing them. And that's true at the international level, of course, as well as the national level. So it's the report, I think the real meat of the report is to get down to the systemic forces that are channeling economic power into political power, and in the process reinforcing the economic power that is increasingly behind this polarized and fragmented and increasingly distant system that people are experiencing.
Explain what you mean by a hyper-globalized world, and why you see the dead weight of austerity, as you put it, as essentially the default macroeconomic policy of a hyper-globalized world.
For us, the hyper-globalized world is a world in which finance has essentially gained the upper hand in policy making. And finance has essentially followed the idea that government is not the solution, government is the problem. And so deregulation, privatization, liberalization have been the overarching policy mantra of the hyper-globalized world. And in that world, when things go wrong, as they inevitably do, the macroeconomic response is always to cut government expenditure, to cut social services of one kind or another, to clamp down on wages. So that's, and even when the source of the problem is not spending of that nature, cutting spending is always becomes the default policy solution. And we've seen that again since the 2008-2009 crisis, particularly in the advanced economies, and it hasn't worked. Inequality has continued to rise. Growth and the recovery have been historically slow. These are the slowest recoveries from an economic crisis that we have seen in the modern era. And finance has been able to resist any sort of serious attempt to rein in its influence. There have been attempts in the Basel discussions, in the Financial Stability Board, etc. So there has been an attempt to, but it's been weak and it's already being rolled back. So austerity is this kind of broad policy brush against which business as usual, the kind of predictable neoliberal policy agenda, has been able to survive, even as its impact has been shown to have been negative and destructive.
Comment on the outlook, as you see it, for moving beyond austerity towards the kind of global New Deal you outline in the TDR.
You have to change the narrative. Obviously, we are 30-odd years into a narrative about the world economy and related policy challenges that have been driven by the neoliberal agenda. That agenda has been challenged in recent years. I mean, the financial crisis being the most obvious challenge to that, but also the weakness of the post-crisis recovery, all pose a big challenge to this dominant narrative. But you can only move forward, of course, if you have an alternative narrative. And it's the job of, I think, an institution like UNCTAD and the Trade and Development Report to try and fashion an alternative narrative. And that's what the report does, speaking primarily to policymakers at the national level, of course, because they're the policymakers that can actually enact the changes. So that's the aim of the report is very much to change the narrative that there are alternatives to neoliberalism. We've both alternatives that we see today and also drawing on historical lessons. I mean, in this report we hark back to the New Deal, the 1930s effort in the United States to refashion the relationship between the economy, society, and its citizens. Because we feel that many of the imbalances and challenges of the 1930s have their analog in imbalances and challenges today. And, you know, if we can do it, if it was done before in the 1930s, why can't it be done again today? And that's where the kind of report kicks off from. Obviously, a global New Deal is not going to take place overnight. It's not something that one can wave a magic wand and shift 35 years of neoliberalism into a different direction. That's clearly not going to happen. But the kinds of pressures and tensions that we are describing in the global economy, we think, are forcing policymakers, often against their wishes, to think differently from the last 35 to 40 years. And it's to play on those concerns and those opportunities that I think UNCTAD as an institution needs to do more of. I think the important thing is not simply to focus on, you know, immediate political shocks at Trump or Brexit. I mean, this is a problem that has been decades in the making. It's not something that has suddenly emerged in 2016 as a series of problems. The negative impact of austerity has been felt in developing countries beginning in the early 1980s. It was there in the debt crisis in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. It resurfaced again after the Asian crisis in 1997. So austerity has a much longer history than the last few years. And looking at all those experiences, I think we can comfortably say that it has not delivered on the promises that it claimed it would make, which is to make a healthier and more dynamic and more productive economy. And so I think there is no alternative, which is a phrase that was hatched by Margaret Thatcher in the early 1980s, has outlived its relevance in terms of the kinds of challenges, the problems of inequality, of instability, indebtedness, insecurity that policymakers are grappling with today. There isn't an international governance system separately from the nation states that make up that system. And therefore, you have to be talking, you have to persuade nation states that they need to change if the international governance system is going to change. That's clear. So you're pitching an argument not at some airy-fairy level about the independence of multilateralism. It's how can what do national level governments, particularly the systemically important governments, have to do to change the system in a way that we can begin to see improvements in the area that we're outlining in the report. Pressure is building up to try alternatives. I think that's clear. One can see that in efforts in the United Kingdom in the recent election. One can see it in the efforts of the European Commission to clamp down on monopoly power of leading IT companies, of tax evasion efforts that you see in the OECD, in the EU. There's efforts to address some of the kinds of abuses of power that we highlight in this TDR. Obviously, this is yet to amount to a concerted move away from neoliberalism. It's still picking at the edges, but it's a mood shift. And I think it's the job of a report like the TDR to build on that change of sentiment and to offer a bolder vision about how these individual or isolated efforts to deal with the consequences of neoliberalism can be woven into a larger narrative and a broader set of policy initiatives, which, if implemented in a more concerted manner, can provide the necessary policy alternative to deliver the inclusive and sustainable outcomes that governments have expressed their desire to achieve through the Sustainable Development Goals and other platforms.
Richard Kozul-Wright, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.